He was 3 years old. He had a cowlick that never laid flat no matter how many times his mother wet it down, a stuffed elephant he refused to sleep without, and a laugh that neighbors up and down the street could pick out of a crowd. On the afternoon of July 11th, 1987, Noah Bennett was playing in his own fenced backyard in Ashford Mills, Ohio, while his mother hung laundry not 20 feet away, and within the space of minutes, he was simply gone. That is not a story about a toddler who wandered off through an unlatched gate. That is a story about a woman who had been watching that house for weeks, waiting for the exact moment a mother's back would be turned just long enough. And it would take 37 years, one ordinary Saturday afternoon, and a cheek swab mailed in for a genealogy kit as a birthday gift to finally bring Noah Bennett back to the family that never stopped looking for him. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that July afternoon and to the little boy Ashford Mills lost without ever understanding what had actually happened to him. Ashford Mills sat along a bend in the Scotto River in southern Ohio, a town of just under 4,000 people built up around a steel fastener plant that had employed 3 generations of the same families by 1987. It was the kind of town where the whole valley smelt faintly of river water and cut grass in summer, where children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on, where every backyard on Maple Court connected to the next through gaps in chain-link fences that nobody bothered to lock, and where mothers hung laundry on the line while keeping half an eye on kids playing nearby, trusting the street the same way their own mothers had trusted it before them. Karen and Tom Bennett had bought their small house on Maple Court the year they married, and Noah was their only child, born after 2 difficult years of trying, which made him, in Karen's own words years later, the answer to every prayer she'd ever said out loud. Tom worked the line at the fastener plant, the same plant his own father had worked, coming home most evenings smelling of machine oil and metal shavings, and Karen stayed home with Noah, filling their small house with the particular chaos of a toddler who narrated everything he did out loud, whether or not anyone was listening. Noah had that cowlick, a gap-toothed grin, and a well-loved stuffed elephant named Ellie that had to be tucked under one specific arm before he'd fall asleep. A ritual Karen performed every single night, without fail. He loved digging in the dirt along the fence line, loved the ice cream truck that came down Maple Court every Tuesday afternoon, chasing it down the sidewalk in bare feet, and had just started saying full sentences that spring, mostly about dinosaurs and about wanting a dog, a request he repeated at nearly every dinner. Karen kept a small spiral notebook where she wrote down the funny things he said, a habit she'd started the week he was born and would, decades later, still be adding to in her own private way, long after there was no one left to say the funny things to write down. Ashford Mills in 1987 still had a 4th of July parade that went right past the Bennett's own street, still trusted neighbors enough to leave garage doors open on hot afternoons, and still believed, the way most small towns believed back then, that the worst thing that could happen to a child in your own backyard was a skinned knee. That was the last summer any of that trust would feel unremarkable. Karen told Noah she'd be right back after she hung one more load of towels. She turned around less than 10 minutes later, and he was gone. At 2:40 p.m. That Friday, Karen Bennett stepped out the back door with a full laundry basket, propping the screen door open with her hip so she could hear Noah playing near his small sandbox at the edge of the yard, the radio in the kitchen still playing behind her. At 2:50, she called out to him and got no answer, assuming at first he'd simply wandered to the far side of the yard chasing the family's cat, something he did most afternoons that summer. By 2:55, after checking the sandbox, the porch, and the small tool shed where he sometimes hid during games of hide and seek, she found the back gate, always kept latched, always checked twice, by habit. A habit Tom had drilled into both of them after a scare the previous summer, standing open, swinging slightly in the afternoon breeze. By 3:00 p.m., Karen was running down Maple Court screaming Noah's name, her laundry basket still overturned in the yard behind her, and neighbors poured out of their own houses within minutes, fanning out across yards and alleys in every direction, calling his name into garages and behind sheds. By 3:20, Tom had been pulled off the line at the plant, his supervisor driving him home himself once the call came through, and he was tearing through the neighborhood in his truck, retracing every route Noah could possibly have wandered on 3-year-old legs in 20 minutes. By 4:00 p.m., the Ashford Mills police had been called, and Detective Walt Corrigan, one of only 4 officers on the town's small force, arrived to find a neighborhood already in a full, frantic search, though with no leads, no witnesses, and no sign of Noah anywhere within the immediate blocks. A single detail stood out from the earliest interviews. 2 separate neighbors recalled seeing an unfamiliar sedan parked at the end of Maple Court that same afternoon, idling for what one of them described as longer than seemed normal, though neither had thought to note a plate number, since nothing about a parked car on a summer day had seemed worth remembering at the time. Search efforts expanded within days to include the entire county, then the surrounding counties, with more than 1,000 volunteers combing riverbanks, wooded lots, and abandoned buildings across southern Ohio over the following weeks. Divers searching stretches of the Scioto River that ran closest to town, cadaver dogs brought in from 3 counties away. Unlike so many cold cases from this era, no body was ever found, which gave the Bennett family something most families in their position never get to hold on to: the possibility, however faint, that Noah might still be alive somewhere. That possibility, over the following decades, became both the family's greatest comfort and its most exhausting burden, a hope that refused either to die or to be confirmed. Detective Corrigan worked the case for years beyond what his department could reasonably justify, chasing down tips from psychics, from truckers who thought they'd seen a matching child at a rest stop 3 states away, from every lead, no matter how thin, driving hundreds of miles on his own time to follow up on sightings that almost never amounted to anything. Records show he built an early list of possible suspects, and the unfamiliar sedan became the investigation's central frustrating mystery, witnessed by 2 people, described only vaguely, and never definitively connected to any known individual in or around Ashford Mills. He circulated a composite sketch based on the vaguest of descriptions to police departments across the Midwest, a sketch that generated hundreds of false leads over the years, but never once connected to an actual suspect. Corrigan's own case notes, kept well past his official retirement in 1998, show he continued informally tracking leads on his own time for years, unable to let go of a case that never gave him a body to bring closure, only an absence that never resolved, a rarity in his long career that he told friends he simply couldn't set down even after he stopped being paid to carry it. He passed away in 2011, having never learned what actually happened to Noah Bennett, a fact his own family said weighed on him until the very end. Karen Bennett refused to ever treat the case as closed, keeping Noah's room exactly as it had been in 1987, Ellie the stuffed elephant still propped against the pillow, waiting, the same dinosaur nightlight still plugged into the wall socket by the door. She gave interviews to any reporter who would listen for decades, kept a hotline number active in her own home for years after the police stopped actively working the case, answering it herself at all hours in case the call ever came, and celebrated Noah's birthday every single year with a cake, just the 2 of them, and later just her alone after Tom passed away in 2009. Worn down, Karen always believed. By 37 years of grief compounding on itself without ever finding an answer, a grief made heavier rather than lighter by the fact that no funeral, no burial, no formal ending had ever been possible. Karen's own sister, Denise, became something like a second mother to the memory of a boy she'd only known for 3 years. And she spent decades helping Karen maintain a website, then a social media page devoted entirely to Noah's case, refreshed every July with the same photograph, a gap-toothed 3-year-old grinning at the camera. One arm wrapped around a stuffed elephant. The caption below it updated every single year with the same simple line: "Still hoping, still waiting, still looking for our boy." Every case we bring you on this channel represents weeks of careful research into a story that deserves more than to be forgotten. If Noah's story means something to you tonight, take a moment to like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Ashford Mills. In April of 2024, a 40-year-old man living under the name Ryan Ostrander in a small town in Oregon received a consumer DNA genealogy kit as a birthday gift from his own teenage daughter, who thought it would be a fun way for the two of them to explore the family tree together over a weekend. He mailed in the sample mostly to humor her, never expecting the results to be anything more than an approximate ancestry breakdown and a handful of distant cousins scattered across the Midwest he'd never bother contacting. 6 weeks later, the genealogy company's system flagged his profile against a law enforcement missing persons database it had recently begun cross-referencing as part of a new partnership program, a feature the company had rolled out quietly the previous year, and that had, until that point, generated only a handful of confirmed matches nationwide. The flag reached Detective Aisha Prentice, who had inherited the Ashford Mills cold case file 2 years earlier as part of a county-wide review of unsolved disappearances involving children, a file she had read cover to cover more than once without ever expecting a living resolution. She read Corrigan's decades-old notes about the unfamiliar sedan, cross-referenced the DNA match against Noah Bennett's file, and found herself staring at a genetic profile that aligned, with overwhelming statistical certainty, to Karen and Tom Bennett's own DNA. Samples the family had voluntarily submitted to a national database years earlier in the faint hope this exact moment might someday arrive, a hope Karen had renewed every few years without ever really expecting it to matter. Prentice drove to Karen Bennett's house herself rather than call, since some news, she felt, deserved to be delivered in person, not filtered through a phone line after 37 years of waiting. She sat with Karen at the same kitchen table where Karen had kept that spiral notebook of Noah's toddler sentences for 37 years, and told her plainly that they believed they had found her son, alive, living under another name, 2,000 miles away. Karen would later say she made Prentice repeat the sentence 3 times before she let herself believe any part of it, and that she then had to call her sister Denise before she could even finish processing what she'd just heard, needing to say the words out loud to someone else to make them feel real. The man known as Ryan Ostrander had been raised by a woman named Diane Ostrander, who had told him for as long as he could remember that his birth mother had died young, and that she was a family friend who had taken him in out of love and obligation. He had grown up with no memory of Ashford Mills, no memory of Maple Court, and no reason whatsoever to question the only life story he had ever been given: building an entire adult life, a marriage, a career, and a daughter of his own on a foundation he had no way of knowing was false. Diane Ostrander had relocated across the country within a year of Noah's disappearance, settling in Oregon under an assumed background and raising the boy she called Ryan with what neighbors there would later describe as ordinary, unremarkable care. The ordinary rhythms of a normal childhood built entirely on top of a lie he had no way of detecting. When investigators contacted him in May of 2024, informing him that DNA evidence connected him to a decades-old missing child case out of Ohio, Ryan's first response, he later said, was simple disbelief. followed by a slow, vertiginous unraveling of every memory he thought he had about his own early childhood, questioning details he had never once thought to question before. A confirmatory DNA test in June of 2024 made it official. Ryan Ostrander was, beyond any statistical doubt, Noah Bennett, missing for 37 years. Diane Ostrander was arrested that same month, by then 74 years old, still living quietly in the same Oregon town where she'd raised the boy she'd taken as a toddler, known to neighbors there as a pleasant, private woman who kept mostly to herself and rarely spoke of her past. She had never married, had no other children, and had spent nearly 4 decades constructing an entire alternate life around a single act of theft she apparently never expected to be undone. Moving twice more in the years since to stay ahead of any chance encounter with someone who might recognize a face from an old news bulletin. When confronted by investigators, she reportedly offered no explanation beyond stating that she had always loved him as her own son, and seemed, according to the detectives present, genuinely bewildered that anyone would view 4 decades of care as anything other than motherhood. She was extradited to Ohio, charged with kidnapping, and pled no contest that November, receiving a sentence that, given her age, amounted to the remainder of her natural life. The community's reaction in Ashford Mills was unlike anything the town had experienced in decades. Less the shock of an unmasking, since Diane Ostrander was a stranger no one there had ever known, and more a slow, disorienting wave of realizing that the family's worst fear, all those years, had in fact not been the truth. And their quieter, more fragile hope had been the truth instead. A realization that left longtime residents both relieved and unsettled in equal measure. Noah Bennett, 37 years after he vanished from a backyard on Maple Court, flew to Ohio in July of 2024 to meet his biological mother for what was, from his own memory, the very first time. Karen Bennett said she recognized her son immediately, cowlick and all, the moment he stepped off the plane, though he carried, understandably, no memory of her at all. Only the disorienting task of learning an entire family and a stolen history from scratch at 40 years old, with a wife and daughter of his own now standing beside him and a town he had no memory of ever having belonged to. Karen showed him the spiral notebook that afternoon, reading aloud the things he'd said as a 3-year-old about dinosaurs and about wanting a dog, and Noah later said, hearing his own toddler voice quoted back to him from a stranger's careful handwriting was the strangest and most overwhelming moment of his entire life. Noah Bennett was 3 years old when he was taken. He had a cowlick, a stuffed elephant named Ellie, and a habit of narrating his own small world out loud to anyone nearby. He had a future that belonged to him by right, one interrupted for 37 years and never fully returned to the family who lost him, even now that he has come home. Karen Bennett said the day Prentice knocked on her door was the first time in nearly 4 decades she let herself believe the word someday might actually mean something. She said grief and joy arrived at the exact same moment, and she still isn't sure, more than a year later, how to hold both at once, since finding her son alive didn't undo 37 years of birthdays celebrated alone, or a husband who died still waiting for an answer that came 13 years too late for him. Ashford Mills has changed enormously since 1987. The fastener plant closed for good in 2003, and half of Maple Court's original families have long since moved away. But Karen still keeps Noah's childhood bedroom exactly as it was. Ellie still propped against the pillow, not because she needs it anymore, but because 37 years of habit doesn't disappear just because the waiting finally ended. How many other families are out there right now, still hanging onto a someday that may or may not ever come? Because a body was never found and hope, however painful, refused to fully die. And what does it mean for a person to learn, at 40 years old, that an entire childhood, however ordinary it felt from the inside, was built on someone else's unforgivable choice? Is Noah Bennett owed the 37 years he lost? Or is there simply no way to calculate what a stolen childhood is worth? If you believe that truth, however long delayed, is always worth waiting for, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep following stories like Noah's, stories about the families who never gave up, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for being here.